Welcome to People and AI, where we explore the intersections of artificial intelligence, ethics, and innovation. I'm your host, Karthik Ramakrishnan, and today we're thrilled to have Dr. Benjamin Roome on the show. Benjamin is the founder of Ethical Resolve, where he spent the last decade helping companies like Meta, TikTok, and Accenture navigate the complex world of AI ethics. He's also the CEO of Badgelist, a digital credentialing platform, and brings a deep background in philosophy, ethics, and education to his work. Today, we'll deep dive into how companies can operationalize AI ethics, manage risks, and stay ahead of evolving regulations. Benjamin, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here, and thank you for that warm introduction.
Yeah, and I'm very excited to have this very topical conversation. I think on a daily basis, we're now seeing an increasing amount of attention that's being paid to the risks that come from AI. We're seeing real life examples of where it's not just about harms to people, but also real concerns for enterprises adopting this technology for their own purposes, right? We go all the way from from consumer harm, but also financial harm to the enterprise itself, reputational harm.
Yes.
And the challenge here is, I think a lot of the discourse that we do on responsible AI makes it seem related just to sort of human ethical concerns.
Yes.
Whereas the harms that we're talking about are much broader. And we need to create enough room to talk about those operational issues that can come while adopting AI as well. And so I'm really excited. I know we've talked about a lot of these things in our last conversation. So I'm really excited to get into the deeper details of all of this. But maybe to kick things off, how did your background in philosophy and ethics lead you to focus on AI and its ethical implications?
Yeah. Okay. Thanks for that question. So I did my philosophy PhD in science and technology studies, and particularly in the relationship between psychiatric diagnostic categories and psychopharmacological intervention. So basically the relationships between mental disorders and the way that they're labeled, and drugs and the way that mental disorders are studied. And so I was taught in this experience to think about science and epistemology and ethics as entangled issues. That basically our modes of knowledge production, our techniques of measurement already contain ethical commitments, ethical boundaries that create our reality. And so when I started to learn more and more about AI and the way that it is generating knowledge about humans, the way it's generating, in some sense, our reality, it was sort of a natural progression from the way I think about our scientific measurement practices and their production of reality. And now the way that we're seeing all of these companies building AI systems, and ultimately this is a new mode of knowledge production, and thus a new way of creating knowledge about humans and the world and our reality in general. And so I still often think about the problems that I face through that lens.
That's interesting. If I can pull on that thread a little bit, the way organizations make decisions today are going to fundamentally be changed by AI with this new mode of not just knowledge creation, but knowledge absorption, and turning that into company strategy, into competitive advantage, into operational, how we operate as human beings within an organization.
Yes.
Can you kind of draw a link to those, those two kind of things that we see as just business as usual things,
right,
that are not going to get impacted by what you're saying?
Well, what's interesting is I've been asked a lot over the course of the past couple of years, like, how should we be thinking about AI sort of through metaphor, right? Like, one of my friends recently asked me, is it more apt to think of AI as like humanity's children, like a new sort of like being that we're creating, or more like a wild horse that's left the barn and like needs to be tamed or something like that? And, what I said was I've been compelled certainly by the notion of AI as humanity's children. And that's like exists a lot in a lot of our narratives. But I actually think it's a mistake to see AI as being other in that way, as being somehow separate from us. More and more, I've been thinking of AI systems as like prosthesis, like cybernetic prosthetics, basically. Like they're an extension of our mind, of our brain, and they're in a way like a recapitulation of human knowledge. But they're making decisions, based on human reasoning practices, but not necessarily in exactly the same way as we would make those decisions. And they're also, able to make these decisions a lot faster. And so in some sense, like when we integrate these types of prosthesis into our corporate practices, what we're seeing is, that in effect, like our tools are taking part in our decision making. And maybe that's happened, as long as there have been computers and, probably a lot of other inventions, right? They're all in some way like entangled with our reality. But I think it's been really thrown into sharp relief as AI systems have, taken this big leap forward in the last 10 years.
Now, you mentioned that there are no ethical companies, but only companies that have developed the capacity to make ethical decisions and doing that at scale. First of all, what does that even mean? And then what does that look like?
Right. So, we say there are no ethical companies because it's not a binary, right? It's not as though we have like achieved the status of being ethical by making only good decisions, right? Like that's impossible for a human. It's impossible for a company. I mean, it's doubly impossible for a company because it's like so many different humans, all making different decisions and not necessarily knowing, how those decisions are going to impact the rest of the people within the organization. And so what we say is basically just there are companies that are capable of developing the capacity to make ethical decisions at scale. Well, what does that mean? That we basically are identifying all the critical decision points, which basically means all the places where harm could occur. And then we're making sure to address those risks before they actually become harms. So the way that Jake, my co-founder, Jake Metcalf, and I think about this and the way that it manifests in companies is that basically trustworthiness is a function of culture and capacity, right? Culture is the ethical commitments that we make, the values commitments that we make. And then capacity is the processes that we implement in order to actually realize those values. And so what I often say is culture without capacity is empty promises, and capacity without culture is empty practices. That, in effect, if you're making commitments, right, you're making a statement of values or principles and putting them on your website, but you're not actually doing anything internally to operationalize those commitments. You're telling a story, but you're not actually backing it up with work. On the other hand, there are a lot of companies that will try to like operationalize an unclear set of values. And then they're like conducting review, but they don't really know what those review practices or governance practices are in aid of. And so then people, particularly engineering and product teams will get frustrated, like engaging in processes that they're not sure what the point of them is. So that's sort of the high level on how I see companies developing ethical practice as a commitment to capacity.
Can you give us an example of some of the sort of what an ethical framework looks like for a company, right? Because
Sure.
I mean, ethics is a pretty subjective in many ways term as well. So,
Totally.
But you're dealing with very structured processes inside an organization. And I often find that there's a disconnect between, okay, what does ethics mean? Like, yes, the ethics do good and what are the right principles to act on, right? Versus in a business function, how does that translate? How should enterprises actually absorb that term?
Yeah, great question. So, what we say is that we never, come in to do consulting with a company to tell them what is the right or wrong decision, but rather just how to make decisions that are consistent with their own organizational values. So what does that look like? Well, basically what we're trying to do is help them implement governance practices and review practices. So we're inviting them to create some sort of ethics review team, right? Usually that contains a member from the legal team, the product team, the engineering team, sometimes data engineering and infrastructure. And then also if there's a corporate risk management or audit function within the organization, we want to get representatives from all of these folks. Also, sometimes information security folks sit on that panel as well. And so then the idea is that for every new product, AI product that you're either going to build or license from another company, this group of folks is going to make a principled decision based on the organization's values about whether the deployment of that technology is consistent with the organization's values. And so then in order to make those decisions rapidly and at scale, what we have to do is engage in the governance practices necessary to furnish that team with the information that it needs to make that decision rapidly, right? To not have to go chase down the data scientist who built a new model that's going into production next week, but instead to just have that information continuously furnished so we can say, okay, this looks like a high risk product. This one's a medium risk product. This one is probably low risk and can be exempt from a full formal review. Whereas a high risk product, we're really going to need to have a lot of information about all the data that went into the model, the training data that went into the model, who the product is going to impact, really understanding like stakeholder impact mapping. This is not just the users, but anyone else who might be impacted downstream by the use of the platform. And then making careful, principled decisions about whether or not this could cause harm and how to ultimately identify and mitigate that harm.
Could you give me give us an example, like let's say 3 sort of values that turn into ethical guidelines that then go into a selection process?
Sure. So, there are so many different ways of articulating values. I would say the standard model for the AI ethics community right now is fairness, accountability, and transparency. And so the critical component of fairness, right, is that we look at the models that are being generated and we make sure that those models, that bias within those models has been addressed in every way possible. So we're really trying to understand the outcomes for a broad variety of people. This means that it works for everyone, regardless of their background. And that the outputs, if the model is built on a training data set that is not representative of our community, then we make sure that we append data to that training data set or alter the model in some ways in order to make sure that the output is fair. The accountability piece is basically the idea that if the company makes a mistake, if it finds out that it has caused harm in some way, that it is accountable to that harm so that it recognizes that harm. It tries to mitigate that harm in whatever ways are possible. And then it makes commitments to ensure that those harms are avoided in the future. Finally, the transparency piece, is just about being open and sharing the outputs, right? So if you are committed to fairness, right, are you measuring those models, your production models for fairness consistently and publishing the outputs of those fairness measures so that people can see, like, look, we are doing continuous testing to ensure that we are not causing harm. And this is the way we are making our practices visible.
Excellent. Very clear. Could we take another example beyond bias? Like, what would another example be that could walk through the same sort of principles that you've outlined?
So yeah, another example beyond the bias question, for instance, we're seeing the growth of Gen AI models and, really this has been the fastest growing area of AI in the last 2-3 years. Obviously the advent of the new models of ChatGPT have had a major impact on our world and our economy already. But of course, we know that these models are prone to hallucination. And so there's an important question sort of really being dealt with right now about how we can create processes within large language models to ensure that hallucinations don't cause harm. And often this requires a second order process of actually like checking to ensure that the outputs of the model are real. So one of my favorite stories in this space has been that an attorney last year filed a legal brief that was written by ChatGPT and the ChatGPT fabricated all the case law in that legal brief. Like it just made it up. Like it made up cases that it thought might be relevant to support this attorney's argument. And this attorney submitted this brief to the court and they were like, we cannot find these cases anywhere. And basically he had to sort of throw himself on the mercy of the court and say, Your Honor, ChatGPT actually wrote this and I failed to check if this case law was real. And so, there are a lot of large language models being used in the legal space right now. then the ones that are good are checking it against LexisNexis to actually make sure that the case law that the LLM generated exists and that the argument that it made is actually the type of argument that a lawyer would make. And so this means you need to have human in the loop as you're developing these models and really check the outputs to make sure that they're consistent and true. And then ultimately that we build systems that are capable of functioning the way humans do to ensure that the outputs are properly fact checked.
Yeah, I love that example. Actually, I have another favorite one, if I can share.
Yeah, please do. I love these.
Have you heard of the Air Canada one?
I don't know. Maybe not.
Yeah,
yet.
So there was a chatbot. This just happened earlier this year. So there was a chatbot that gave on Air Canada's website that said, where a consumer went in and said, "Can you tell me what's your bereavement policy?" Right? And basically, the chatbot came in and said, "Well, you can go book your ticket and then you can get a discount, which is apparently part of the policy. You can get a discount later on. Just go book your ticket, go do your thing, come back, and then you can apply for it." Except that the policy, if you read the actual policy, it says before booking the ticket, you need to have it cleared by an agent.
Right.
Get approval first and then book your ticket and go ahead.
Right.
Right. So now you have the situation where this consumer did exactly what the chatbot said, which had hallucinated this process.
Yeah.
And when he went back to get his refund, of course, it's denied. And then, per person, obviously already going through, a bereavement or an emergency situation in the house, dealing with all of that, and then now suddenly being denied something that the company's chatbot said he should have. He went to the courts, small claims. The court sided with the consumer, and Air Canada had to honor what the chatbot had said.
Yep.
Because the accountability, as stated by the court, still resides with the organization.
Yes.
Now, here's what's happened as a result. To me, this goes beyond just, if we look at it just from the sense of from an ethical standpoint, where this to me is not bias. It's about let's not put our consumers, our clients, our customers through excess, anguish.
Right.
Than what they need to have. Let's give them fair service. Transacting and working with us as an organization and our brand should not be this hard.
Yes,
right?
Exactly.
And I think, to me, if you'd applied those transparency testing procedures, the framework as you outlined, right, robustness, explainability, all of these things that go into before putting out a system, you would have avoided these issues, right?
Yes.
And that, to me, is also part of the ethical considerations.
Yeah, exactly. I love that example. And you've triggered another memory, which is that I actually just did a great series of interviews with a couple of founders of AI and healthcare companies. And so one of them, Christian Riley from Mednition, they have built a sepsis prediction model. And of course, sepsis is a major problem in hospitals, right? People die all the time from sepsis. And it's not always easy to detect. And so, insofar as we're getting, reduced clinician time, the United States is expected to have a shortage of 86,000 clinicians in the next 10 years. And so we need these AI systems in order to make up that windfall. But what it doesn't mean that we can do is make the experience worse for the patient or for other caregivers, right? And so the accuracy of these models is absolutely critical, right? Giving a false positive or a false negative, making the clinician second guess themselves or have to even worse, order a blood test, even though the clinician, based on all of their expertise, believes that the patient is not septic, right? And sometimes these models can catch sepsis when the clinician does not notice it or expect it. And that's incredibly valuable as long as it's accurate. And so Mednition has engaged in this incredibly painstaking process to ensure that all of their training data is as precisely detailed as possible. They have a team of 10 clinicians on staff, and anytime they are looking to append a new training data set or add a feature to the model, any one of these clinicians can veto that change to the model if they don't believe that it will produce safer or more accurate results. And so it's that kind of responsible AI practice that's critical to the trustworthiness of the company, right? And it works better for clinicians. And that's why when they get new customers, they don't lose them, right? There's a big electronic healthcare records company that also built a sepsis model. And frankly, it doesn't work. Like, it was first deployed several years ago. They did field testing on it. It turned out to not work nearly as well as the company claimed. The company then rebuilt and redeployed it. It's still not working, and this is undermining trust for that company. And so it's really critical that we see these companies, make the type of commitments to doing to making the best model possible and taking the time and the extra expense, frankly, to ensure that these models work perfectly every time, or not perfectly, but as effectively as possible.
As close to perfect as possible.
Right. Exactly.
Right? I mean, that's the thing, right? These models being probabilistic are never going to be
right. Exactly
perfect.
Yeah.
Right. But at least as close to it as we can. Mm-hmm. So, this is, the EU AI Act, for instance, and in other jurisdictions as well, education and digital privacy, biometric systems, they all come under high risk use cases of AI. To your work with the badge list and digital credentializing has grown alongside advances in AI. So how do you see AI reshaping? Well, first of all, could you explain that? What does digital credentializing mean?
Oh, okay. So our digital credential platform is called Badge List. Basically, it's just an online credential where earners can earn a badge that reflects a learning experience or expertise or competency that they have gained. And so that can be expressed in the form of a badge. We always like it when there's evidence of that learning experience associated with the badge, so that when someone comes to look in and see, like, okay, this person has a badge that expresses a certain skill or competency, like, I can actually see the learning evidence that was generated in order to prove that skill or competency. But of course, there are a whole bunch of data privacy risks, especially when you're talking about working with folks who are under 18, right? Like, we have to do a lot of work to ensure that, that student data is private and only available to the teachers who are looking at that student data. Because ultimately, like, student work is a form of personally identifiable information, right? At the very least, it's often got the student's name on it, et cetera, et cetera. But so digital credentialing, is something that has emerged over the course of the last 10 years. And we're seeing some incredible advances now in the workforce development space and bridging the gap from education to employment by people being able to express skills and competencies at a more granular level than just, I hold this or that degree.
Fantastic. Okay, thanks for that.
Sure.
And I think now we get to the crux of it. Like, how do you see AI reshaping, first of all, education, and then now particularly in assessment and credentialing?
So what we're, I think, seeing, and I work with a friend of mine, Rob Bajer, who runs a company called Micro Credential Multiverse, who's thought very carefully about the way that education is going to be sort of changed. He sometimes says disrupted by digital technologies. And I think what we're going to see is the growth of AI-generated skills taxonomies. Companies like Workera have already generated these taxonomies, and we'll be able to see skills taxonomies being generated for very, very niche work contexts, so that employers and educators have really, really detailed communication about the sorts of skills that employers are looking for. And that information can be passed almost on a real-time basis to educators. Like, look, we have a new technology that's being used in the workplace, and we need people to be skilled up on this. Like, your learners right now, if we're going to hire them, we really want them to have this expertise. And so the faster that these skills taxonomies can be generated and made into the basis of communication between employers and educators, we're going to start to see much more rapid matching of workers and open job opportunities, so that, as our economy and the needs of our economy change ever more rapidly, that we will be able to redeploy skills into the relevant work role with as little friction as possible.
Awesome. Now, why are the regulators concerned about AI in education then?
Well, I mean, the regulators are concerned about AI in all the different contexts, and right, the more sensitive the context, I think the more the regulators are concerned, right? So we talk a lot, and there's been, in the United States, like the New York law, the New York AI in employment and hiring law. And I think it's because there's a lot of sensitivity around the way that your skills profile gets expressed and what sorts of opportunities you might have available. And so like if you, express yourself linguistically in the way that the model, like in the way that the data on which the model has been trained, it expresses a particular skill or competency or ability or, the likelihood for a job fit, then you're more likely to get that job. But because there is bias in that training data set, that will mean that jobs are more likely to go to the people who look like the people who already have those jobs. And that, of course, does not increase fairness in our culture. And so I think when we're looking at skills profiles and the way that people go about getting jobs, what we need to make sure is that these technologies increase fairness. They increase diversity of opportunity rather than limiting it and perpetuating the bias that already exists in the way that that hiring decisions get made currently.
So we're also hearing, so there's one thing to be biased through your models. Mm-hmm. And so the other piece is assuming that there's bias because it's a model. Mm-hmm. How do you counter both? Because now, so I've been speaking to some lawyers, and they're now seeing a rise in lawsuits mm-hmm. when an applicant is rejected, where the applicant just assumes that because a model was used, or assumes a model was used in the first place, to say the model probably got it wrong, and mm-hmm. therefore I was rejected.
Right.
How should an organization deal with that, right? Because we've been talking about that there's so many issues yes. that models have mm-hmm. that now the ingoing assumption is there's an issue. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Ooh, this is a tricky one. So first, let me say I am not an attorney. And so it's hard to make these kinds of distinctions. But, of course, there are precedents about what constitutes disparate impact, right? In this country, it's the 4/5 rule. When I say this country, I mean the United States. And that, the legal precedent for disparate impact in the 4/5 rule actually has a really fascinating social history. Briefly, it was decided, to use this 4/5 like threshold to determine fairness in employment in Alameda County in the 70s. And there was a debate about whether or not, fairness should be, they should be required to reach a 90% fairness threshold, or if 70% was okay. And so these two camps just sort of split the difference and decided like, okay, then 80%. So, here's another really fascinating context, about like the social components of science. And so these thresholds can be somewhat arbitrary, but ultimately they can be legally binding as well. And so ultimately mm-hmm. what your organization has to do in order to demonstrate fairness is demonstrate that you have reached whatever threshold is required by law. Now, a lot of companies are trying to go over and beyond those thresholds, right? They're holding themselves to a 90% standard, a 95% standard, a 98% standard based on the model and the training data that they have available, right? And I think, of course, one, meet your legal requirements. And then two, just commit to continuous improvement of the accuracy of your model, right? Like, if that is a value in your organization, that it's like, look, we will always meet our legal requirements. Obviously, you have to do that. And then step two, right? Like we will continuously improve these things, try to always improve the impacts on everyone, try to make sure that these models and the products that we're demonstrating or that we're deploying are like aspiring to an ever increasing standard of fairness. That is the approach that I recommend.
Fair enough. In fact, to me, the burden of proof will come down to the organization to say that they've adhered and have established practices. Mm-hmm. Precisely what you're saying, right? Mm-hmm. So if they have an ethical AI manifesto, mm-hmm. policies, mm-hmm. governance that they have implemented and that they're following. This is precisely why you need one of these, right? Because
Exactly.
when you do get asked that question, then you have the proof and the traceability of that proof to say, look, this is how we conduct ourselves.
Right.
Not because there's a regulation or because there's a standard that I have to adhere to, but this is the right thing to do.
Right.
But anyways, we've got this in place.
Right.
And so if ever a question, you can bring that up, right? And that's where transparency helps.
Exactly. And it's pertinent that you bring up regulation there, because that is, of course, exactly what the regulators will be asking for, right? It's like, we want to see the paper trail. How do you make these decisions? How did you measure them? What are you committed to? How are you realizing these commitments? And how can you prove that these commitments are being realized, right? Like, for better or for worse, governments, like, they expect industries to regulate themselves. And it will be the same, right? Like, the government right now is asking the AI industry, like, how should you be regulated? And ultimately what this looks like is that, every company is going to have to just provide, documentation that shows what are the impacts of these models. How are we thinking about this? And then how are we identifying and mitigating risk? And if there's benefit that gets generated by these models, how does that benefit accrue to all people as equally as possible?
Yeah, no, couldn't agree more. So shifting gears a little bit, right? So if we carry this to the next logical conclusion, we're talking about risk mitigation, right? So what happens when you do get a lawsuit or a regulator or whoever says, hey, I want to see how you've done this to make sure that, you're doing it, you're not doing it right. And so risk mitigation is the heart of responsible AI to me. So in your opinion, what are some of the most significant risks for companies in deploying AI as you see them today, particularly for large scale systems?
Yeah, I think it a lot of it just goes back to, to impacts, right? Like, what are the harms that are being generated? And so when we ask companies to engage in ethical design practices, ultimately what we're asking them to do is engage in stakeholder impact mapping and then figure out how they can make their products and models treat all of these stakeholders in such a way as, to consider them as people who are worthy of ethical concern, and that their impacts, whatever they might be, whether they're social impacts, whether they're economic impacts, that they have considered these impacts and then that they have addressed them in the deployment of the model or product. And so in a way, it's not that what we're doing with AI ethics is something radically new. Like, we're just asking people to engage in thoughtful design practices, right? A lot of this can be thought of in the same way we think about UI, UX, but we're also asking people to think about downstream impacts. So one of the kind of big scandals that's been happening lately is that the FBI just raided a company. Let me see if I can find the name of it. They have been doing an antitrust investigation, and they have targeted a company called Realpage, which does price setting for landlords. So basically, it's an app, in my understanding, that landlords can say where their property is located, and then they can ultimately figure out, like, okay, how much are the rest of the these local properties renting for, and what's the best price that I can get for for this rental property. Well, on one angle, right, this is just like looking for economic advantage. Welcome to capitalism. But this company has actually been accused of algorithmic collusion or algorithmic price fixing, which of course is illegal. And it's like, what it's doing is ultimately allowing all of these landlords to like simultaneously raise the rent in their neighborhood, so that they're basically engaging in anti-competitive practices. And so the company that built that algorithm, I would argue they they thought about their users, right? The landlords, the people who are paying for their app. What they didn't think was about the downstream impact of the people who are trying to rent properties in these locations, right? And so if this company had engaged in better ethical design practices, I think they would have avoided this. And actually, I know stories about other organizations who, there was concern about the idea that there might be algorithmic collusion taking place within their app, but they actually identified that as a risk while they were building the product, and were able to avoid that without building a product that then they're generating what we like to call ethical debt, which is like the type of technical debt that's required when you have made an ethical mistake that is instantiated in your product or your business model. And now you have to go back and make changes to that model in order to mitigate harms that you're creating.
Now this can be called algorithmic collusion because there's one model, right? That's across all the landlords is with the same model that's making these decisions, right? If you extend out to the future, there's two companies. They have their own model, but the models monitor the other companies', let's say, prices, right? In this case. So if one model says, I'm going to increase my price and see what happens. The other model sees that and says, oh, they've increased their price. I can increase my price too.
Right.
Because, that's our company strategy. We're going to keep the same price. So again, independent models, that's not collusion.
Right. Right. As long as they genuinely are like generated independently, but then also, there's some really interesting questions there, right? Like
exactly
what is the algorithm that got built? Is, did the same company build this algorithm and sell it to these two other companies to train their models? Like,
no,
does that constitute, right?
What if it's two realistic? They built their own model. They have a data, each has a data science team.
Right. And they have their own data set. I think that's critical. Yeah, totally.
Exactly. They use their own data set. And the objective function for the model was monitor the prices in the neighborhood.
Right.
For all my real estate properties, this model's got the same objective function. Monitor all the prices in that neighborhood, and then adjust price to maximize profit.
Right. It's very nuanced.
So, this to me, like this is the little bit of kind of the, the what's that, the stapler, whatever, the nail analogy where there's an AGI and then just
the paperclip problem.
Yes. Paperclip problem. Thank you. Yes.
It's like stapler, paperclip.
It's a Friday afternoon.
Stapler, nail. I love it. Paperclips. It's exactly the object between the staple and the nail. Exactly.
There you go. The paperclip problem. And now you're optimizing for paperclips. But this is the paperclip problem in reverse or some like a variation of thereof, right? So, look, this is where oversight has to happen. So I don't know where this will end up when we have an agentic systems. We're moving to that agentic world. We said would come like 7 years ago. I think this is all going to be interesting to see.
Yep.
Because on the other hand, I can also see another agent saying, if you're going to increase the prices, after a certain point, I'm going to decrease my prices.
Right.
Because the renter will come to me.
We're engaging in competition again, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right. So I'm going to go for the cheaper sort of opportunity and attract clients. So I think that there's safeguards against that too. But yes, one system used by everyone, I think does become a challenge. I think when you have these micro siloed, custom built agents and solutions using models, I think could still give us that level of, how do I put this? Agency, if you will.
Yeah. It's fascinating. We don't know where all these technologies are going. We can make predictions, but we don't know what they will be capable of, right. There's a lot of discussion in this industry about AGI and whether or not it's a threat to the human species. How worried should we be about the paperclip problem or something similar? But what I have said, and this is something that's sort of been like woven into the fabric of ethical resolve from the very beginning, is that in order to address these future problems, we always need to be engaging in rigorous local attention to the problems of today, right? Like what problems are going to emerge in the future, we don't know. But the only way we can get better at addressing them is by looking at the problems that are surfacing now and getting great at addressing the ones that are right in front of us.
No, absolutely. I think personally, I worry less about, the AI is taking over the world, which is so futuristic.
Right.
Versus we have problems today.
Right. Exactly.
That we need to address.
Yeah.
And focusing regulation, hyper targeting to that. And I think there was a period of time last year, the last 2 years, where there was some, misdirection there. Right?
I agree.
Worry about AI's taking over the world and focus on regulation there, but don't look at what we're doing today.
Right. Exactly. Which is like creating a whole bunch of harm. It's like, oh, no, you should be worried about the Terminator, not about the fact that these technologies are engaging in algorithmic
It's not a Terminator.
Right?
It's a baby Terminator. Look how cute it is. It's not really a Terminator.
It's just making paper clips. What's the big deal?
There you go. Okay. Benjamin, this has been amazing. Unfortunately, we're running out of time, but
sure, yeah.
We'd love some final thoughts from you. Like, what advice would you give companies that are starting to think about AI ethics? Where should they begin? Because this is a question I get asked all the time.
Yeah, totally. So I think it always begins with, what are your values commitments? Who are you as an organization, individually and collectively? And this is one of the reasons why I love to get in the room early in the growth of a company, right? Just the founding team, the first 25, the first 50 employers, because we can get everybody in the room and figure out okay, these are the types of technologies that we're building and deploying. What are we committed to as a group? What's the reality that we want to see? Everyone wants to make the world a better place. How are you actually doing that? And what are you committed to not doing as you build these technologies? Then the next step is to build the governance practices, right? The review practices and the practices that furnish that review team with the data that they need to make consistent ethical decisions at scale, and to ensure that your values are being realized at every step of the development of your company, whether or not you're building your own AI systems, whether you're licensing another company's AI systems. You need to think about whether or not these systems are being built and deployed in ways that are consistent with your organizational values. Last piece of advice is a project manager for the review committee. I know this sounds like so mundane, but if you have one person that is really committed, every ethical decision is going to need to, be looked at by the same person in the organization. They will be able to then decide, okay, this is what, needs to go through a full committee review, and this is what can get an exemption. If you have one person who's sort of the buck stops with them in terms of the ethical practice of the organization, that is how nothing slips through the cracks. Again,
accountability comes down to accountability. I think my takeaway is, right, create that representative committee from across the organization.
Yes.
Have this may sound to many as putting in more sort of decision by committee, but it's not. It should be helpful. If it is becoming that, then you need to address that versus the fact that you need to have different voices from across the organization that push the agenda forward. And to your point, have the one throat to choke. That who's responsible, not literally, but
dark metaphor, Karthik. But I really do love what you said, that, right, this is not just about diversity of expertise, it's also about diversity of background, right? What you want is representation in that committee. You don't want everyone thinking the same way. And that, I'm really glad you brought that up, that it's critically important. So very good insight there.
Excellent. Ben, I knew this would be fun, but thanks for the laughs. I think this was excellent. I really enjoyed the conversation. I'm sure future listeners will as well. And thank you for coming on again, and looking forward to having you back.
Yeah, absolutely. If you want to talk to me or have any questions, my email is ben@ethicalresolve. You can also find me on LinkedIn.
Awesome.
All right. Thanks, Karthik. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.